This statue of Queen Victoria stands at the entrance to the Royal Victoria Hospital, Belfast. The hospital was built nearly 100 years ago and named after the monarch who had reigned for over 60 years in the 19th century. But Victoria was much more than just Queen of England. Her full title was Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Empress of India. And her authority extended over all the countries that made up the British Empire. Most impressive.
At its height, the British Empire was the largest that the world had ever seen. The empire was made up of lots of different countries in all 5 continents that were known as colonies. People of every race and nationality found themselves living under British rule in the different colonies. The empire covered so much of the globe that it was said to be an empire on which the sun never set. Ireland was part of this mighty empire, but was much more than just an overseas colony. Ireland was part of what was then known as the Mother Country, ruled by Queen Victoria. In Victorian times, all 32 counties of Ireland were ruled directly from London. Counties Antrim and Down, Cork and Kerry, along with all the others, were firmly part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It had been like this since 1801, when the Act of Union became law and Ireland was integrated with the British political system. Under that system, members of Parliament from all over Ireland sat in the House of Commons and Irish peers sat in the House of Lords. The Church of England was united with the Church of Ireland, and there was free trade between Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. Before the Act of Union, Ireland had its own parliament for about 400 years. In the 18th century, it met here, in this magnificent building in the centre of Dublin, which now houses the Bank of Ireland. This is the mace that was used to symbolise the authority of the old Irish House of Lords. The Irish Lords used to meet here in this room, which contains 2 tapestries, which show 2 great events that are still commemorated by Irish Protestants today. One shows the Protestant King William of Orange urging his troops on to victory at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. The other shows his father-in-law, the Catholic King James, outside the city of Londonderry during the famous siege of 1689. For over 100 years after the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, members of the Irish Parliament were nearly all rich, influential landowners, descended from English families who came here in the 17th century to settle on land formerly owned by the native Irish. Most were Protestant by religion, and indeed saw fit to rule Ireland in the Protestant interest, despite the fact that the majority of Irish people were Roman Catholic. Both Catholics and Protestants saw themselves as Irish, but in very different ways. And these different attitudes were to become very important in the crisis that developed in Ireland in the latter part of the 19th century. The crisis was about whether Ireland should be ruled from Dublin or London, and has affected the lives of British and Irish people ever since. It's come to be known as the Home Rule Crisis. The British mother country was made up of 4 quite distinct countries: England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. Their national flags were combined to form a new Union flag, or Union Jack. Elected representatives were sent from all 4 countries to serve as members of Parliament in the House of Commons at Westminster in the capital London. The numbers of MPs reflected the size of each country's population. Then as now, England was the largest and most dominant of these 4 countries. In 1881, a census was taken to establish exactly how many people were living in the different parts of the British Isles. In that year, Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 44 years. In 1881, over 24 million people lived in England. It was the world's most advanced industrialised nation, and increasing numbers of people were living in the towns and cities. Ireland had a population of about 5.5 million people. The total had dropped from 8.5 million since the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s. Scotland had a population of 3.7 million. The majority lived in the lowlands near the cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. Wales had a population of 1.5 million. Most still lived in the countryside, but its coal mines were an important source of power for Victorian factories. All over the British Isles, contrasts were sharp between the country and the city, rich and poor. It was in Ireland that these contrasts were most marked, and it was in Ireland that they had the most profound political effect. During the 1840s, disease destroyed the crops of potatoes, the main food of half the Irish people. 1 million died of starvation, and another 1 million left Ireland forever to emigrate to Britain, America, and beyond. Many Irish nationalists blamed England for the catastrophe and wanted nothing more to do with Britain or her empire. Irish nationalists believed that all of the inhabitants of the island of Ireland were one people. They looked forward to the day when Ireland would have its own government in Dublin. Some nationalist leaders hoped that they could achieve their aims by peaceful means. Daniel O'Connell was born into a Catholic landed family in County Kerry. Strongly against methods of violence, he led a successful popular campaign to get emancipation, that is, the right of Catholics to become members of Parliament in 1829. He failed to get the Act of Union repealed in the 1830s and 1840s. Isaac Butt was a Donegal-born Protestant who became a lawyer, professor of politics at Trinity College Dublin, and in 1852 a Conservative Member of Parliament. In 1870 he launched the Home Rule movement to get Ireland a Parliament of her own in Dublin, but without leaving the British Empire. Charles Stewart Parnell was a Protestant landlord from County Wicklow. Elected Home Rule MP for Meath in 1875, he created the Irish Parliamentary Party and became its leader in 1880. At different times in the 19th century, these leaders represented the opinions of the majority of Irish nationalists who favoured gradual change through the British parliamentary system. But others wanted to break the link with Britain completely and believed in revolutionary change using violence if necessary. Thomas Davis from Mallow, County Cork, became the leader of the Young Ireland movement in the 1840s. He founded the Nation newspaper in 1842. John Mitchell was the son of a Presbyterian minister from Dungiven, County Derry. He was arrested just before the armed rebellion of 1848 and sentenced to 14 years imprisonment in Tasmania, which was then known as Van Diemen's Land. He escaped, lived in America and returned to Ireland in 1874 and was elected MP for Tipperary. James Stephens and John O'Mahony founded the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB, in 1858. Members of the IRB became known as Fenians, the name being derived from the Fianna, or army of Finn McCool in the old Irish stories. The Fenians recruited members in Ireland and among Irish immigrant communities in Britain and the United States. They collected money for weapons and rose in rebellion against British rule in Ireland in 1867. The rebellion was easily suppressed and those captured were tried and imprisoned. Nevertheless, many Fenians were to exert an important influence on the development of Irish history during the next 50 years. Irish nationalists felt a very strong feeling of grievance against the British. And these feelings were strongest amongst the poor. Many in the countryside still led lives of wretched poverty. The land that they worked was often poor itself, and the farms too small. Little wonder they resented paying rents they could hardly afford to those who seemed to represent British authority in Ireland. Much of the land was divided into great estates and then subdivided to be rented out to tenant farmers. Failure to pay the rent could result in tenants being thrown off their land. This was called eviction. Evictions caused great resentment among the poor. Police and military were often called out to protect the bailiffs from angry crowds. Sometimes, tenants refused to leave and families would barricade themselves inside their houses. If that happened, bailiffs would have to use battering rams to break down the walls. The owners or landlords of these estates lived in fine mansions like Castletown House near Selbridge, County Kildare. Some landlords were very rich, with their lifestyles being paid for by the rents charged to the tenant farmers. Most people in the countryside didn't live in a splendid big house, but had to be content with a much more humble cottage, like this one. In some of the poorest areas, the family might have to share their cottage with pigs and cows. It must have been pretty cramped in a place like this. Pretty smelly too. The stark differences between the lives of the rich landlord and the poor tenant led to widespread resentment. Michael David was a member of the IRB. He lost his right arm in a Lancashire mill accident as a child. In 1879, he founded a new group called the Land League. The slogan of the new group was Land for the People, and its aim was to fight on the side of small tenant farmers. Charles Stewart Parnell was the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, which promoted Home Rule. Parnell also saw the importance of the Land League and that the demands of the tenant farmers to own their land was tied to the national question. He became the president of the Land League. The activities of the Land League were to become central to the Irish nationalist cause. New tactics were adopted to shun any landlord who tried to rent out the holding of an evicted farmer. It was called boycott, after a captain boycott, agent for Lord Erin's estate near Lochmask, County Mayo. No one would work for Captain Boycott to lift his potatoes or thresh his corn until 50 Protestant labourers from Cavan and Monaghan volunteered to go to his assistance. It took 7,000 troops to protect the Orangemen, and in the end it cost £10,000 to save his crops. It would clearly cost far too much to rescue every landlord in Ireland faced with a boycott. Landlords and their agents were also under threat of physical violence. In September 1880, Lord Mountmorris was ambushed and shot dead by gunmen in County Galway. The Connaught Telegraph reported that local people were reluctant to help the authorities apprehend the killers. Extreme nationalist violence also erupted in Dublin in 1882, when the new Chief Secretary in Ireland, Lord Frederick Cavendish, was assassinated in the Phoenix Park, along with his Under-Secretary, T.H. Burke. The killers belonged to a secret society known as the Invincibles. Their actions threatened the prospects for any peaceful change in Ireland. William Ewart Gladstone was the politician charged with the responsibility for finding a solution to the problems in Ireland. Gladstone was a Member of Parliament from 1832 onwards. He was Liberal Prime Minister for 4 separate periods. He disestablished the Church of Ireland in 1869, passed Irish Land Acts in 1870 and 1881, and promoted the first 2 Home Rule Bills of 1886 and 1893. Gladstone's mission was to pacify Ireland. At first he gave more power to the police, but this only made things worse. Then he put through the Land Acts. From now on, landlords were prevented from evicting tenants providing their rents had been paid, and land courts reduced the level of rents. These acts gave many tenant farmers what they'd always wanted. The way was now clear for Gladstone to introduce the first Home Rule Bill. There was only one stumbling block: Ulster. Ever since the plantation of Ulster by Scots and English settlers in the 17th century, Ulster had been different from the rest of Ireland. The plantation introduced a sizable Protestant population into what until then had been a Catholic country. In time, these Protestants were to become the majority community. In the late 18th century, Northern Presbyterians had been prominent in the formation of the United Irish movement. Many of these Protestant United Irishmen from Antrim and down took part in the 1798 rebellion against the British Crown. The rebellion came in the middle of a long war with France, and Britain was worried that Napoleon would land his troops in Ireland. In 1801, the Act of Union was passed, partly to eliminate this threat by controlling Irish affairs from London. Just over 80 years later, the Ulster Protestant community was firmly wedded to the cause of unionism. Unionism was a movement that supported the 1801 Act of Union between Great Britain and Ireland. It gained strength during the Home Rule Bills of 1886 and 1893, when Liberals and Conservatives supporting the Union came together, calling themselves Unionists. In Ulster, Unionism was closely associated with the Orange Order, an organisation that aimed to defend Protestant interests. Unionists gave their wholehearted allegiance to the cause of the Crown and the Empire. During the 19th century, northeast Ulster developed differently from the rest of Ireland. Belfast was already a larger city than Dublin and was now one of the great ports of the British Empire. Its prosperity was based on heavy industry that gave it the appearance of a city in England or Scotland. In Harland and Wolff, Belfast had the largest shipyard in the world. The Queen's Island Yard made passenger vessels for the White Star Line to profit from the rapidly growing passenger trade across the Atlantic Ocean to America. Building these ships was a tough and painstaking business, but these skilled tradesmen took great pride in their work and saw themselves as an elite workforce. They were in the main predominantly Protestant, and with their livelihood connected to the wider trade and commerce of the empire, were inclined to support the link with Britain. Parts of Belfast were dominated by large linen mills. Ulster had become the greatest centre for linen production in the world, and thousands of men, women and children worked in these mills spinning and weaving linen cloth. Water from streams like the Blackstaff and the Farset that ran down from the hills behind Belfast provided the steam power that drove the heavy mill machinery, and it was around these streams that the mills were built. Industry in Belfast was thriving, but many working people still lived in conditions of extreme poverty.
The people living in these areas shared a hard life as they struggled to make a living. But politically, they were still divided over the issue of Home Rule. Catholic nationalists living on the Falls saw themselves as Irish, so they were for Home Rule. But Protestant Unionists living on the Shankill saw themselves as British, and they were most definitely against it. Today, Belfast is still a city divided unto itself, and this formidable barrier seems to symbolise all that divides Catholic nationalist from Protestant Unionist. Today's peace line actually follows the underground course of the River Farset, the river that gave Belfast its name, and which was right at the heart of the Northern Industrial Revolution. It was here in the 1880s, in what is now a dilapidated borderland between two hard-pressed communities, where the conflict over Home Rule erupted into extreme physical violence. These two communities are still bitterly divided on how this part of the island of Ireland should be governed. Here, the conflict over Home Rule lingers on. I'm sure you appreciate the extremely grave nature of the crisis which is impending over you, and the vital necessity of rallying all you can to your standard. On you, primarily, rests whether Ireland shall remain an integral portion of this great empire, sharing in its glory, partaking of all its strength, benefiting by all its wealth, or whether, on the other hand, Ireland shall become the focus and the center of foreign intrigue and deadly conspiracy. Prepare, so that Home Rule will not come upon you as a thief in the night. Ulster will fight, and Ulster will be right. Ulster will fight, and Ulster will be right. These defiant words were spoken by Lord Randolph Churchill when he came to Ulster in February 1886 to address a monster meeting of Conservatives and Orangemen here in Belfast's Ulster Hall. Churchill was an English Conservative politician vehemently opposed to Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister, who proposed to introduce a bill that would give Home Rule to Ireland. British Conservatives had decided to ally themselves closely with the Protestant Orange Order. Indeed, Churchill himself had said that if Gladstone went for Home Rule, the Orange card was the one to play. Please God it may throw out the ace of trumps and not the two. The stakes were high in the game for Ireland. Gladstone had only come to power a month before, in alliance with 86 nationalist MPs of the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by Parnell. The nationalists hoped that a Home Rule bill would be passed. If that happened, Ireland would remain part of the British Empire, but the United Kingdom would be no more. Most of the Irish nationalists were Catholic by religion. Ulster Protestants dreaded the prospect of being ruled by a Catholic majority in a Dublin Parliament. Many Unionists claimed that Home Rule meant Rome Rule. Battle lines were being drawn that would affect the course of British and Irish politics for at least the next 100 years. Gladstone introduced the Home Rule Bill to the House of Commons on the 8th of April, 1886. The House was so packed that members had to sit on the steps and even on each other's knees. The bill promised the Irish little more than control over the courts, the police and the civil service. Nevertheless, nationalists gave Gladstone their unreserved backing. In the end, however, Joseph Chamberlain and other Liberals deserted Gladstone. They feared that Home Rule could threaten the very existence of the empire by setting a bad example to the peoples of South Africa, India and elsewhere. The first Home Rule Bill was finally defeated on the 8th of June 1886. The issue may well have been settled in the Commons for the time being, but it certainly wasn't on the streets of Belfast. Serious rioting between Catholics and Protestants began in the poorer areas of Belfast a few days before the final defeat of the bill on June the 8th. Much of this rioting took place in the Brickfields, an area that lay between the Catholic Lower Falls and the Protestant Shankill Road. These rioters would use anything that came to hand in their battles, but the favourite weapon was the kidney paver, a kidney-shaped paving stone that was rooted up from the road by the women to hand to their menfolk to use as ammunition. Extra detachments of police were called in to try and prevent further outbreaks of trouble. They met with great hostility on the fervently loyalist Shankill Road. Driven back by a mob of some 2,000 rioters, 72 constables and their officers, 3 magistrates and 1 journalist took refuge in the small 2-storey Bowers Hill barracks. Then, after a salvo of paving stones destroyed the telegraph apparatus, the police fired wildly back into the crowd, killing 7 rioters. The besieged policemen had to stay where they were until a detachment of the Highland Light Infantry came to their rescue. The fact that many of the police constables were Southern Catholics convinced many Protestants that Gladstone's government was intent on punishing them for opposing Home Rule. While the local newspapers reported on the riots from their own particular political standpoints, all condemned the violence which was to continue all through the summer. By the middle of October, around 50 people, both Protestant and Catholic, had been killed. The failure of the first Home Rule Bill signalled a series of setbacks for Irish nationalism. Gladstone's Liberal government was forced to resign, and the Conservatives were now back in power in Westminster. In 1890, the Irish Parliamentary Party was bitterly divided in a quarrel that centred on the personal life of Charles Stewart Parnell. Catherine, or Kitty O'Shea, was revealed to Parnell's lover. William O'Shea, a nationalist MP, was Catherine's husband, and in 1889 he brought a divorce action against Parnell. He offered no defence and subsequently married his beloved Kitty, but the scandal was to cost him the leadership of his party, because Gladstone declared he couldn't continue his alliance with the Irish nationalists unless Parnell resigned as leader. This Parnell refused to do. He was condemned by the Catholic Church. Then in December 1890, the Irish Parliamentary Party voted to depose him as leader. He again refused to accept this and died a year later at the age of 45, worn out and embittered by this vain attempt to hold on to power. In 1892, Gladstone again came to power and prepared to introduce a second Home Rule Bill. Seeing the continued threat, the Ulster Unionists organised their resistance. 6 years earlier, the Ulster Unionist cause had been seriously damaged by sectarian violence and rioting. But now a much more controlled response was prepared. The Unionists organised a demonstration to be held in a glass-roofed convention hall, specially constructed for the occasion here in the grounds of Belfast Botanic Gardens.
The building covered 1 acre and was the largest which had ever been erected in Great Britain or Ireland for political purposes. The mood was sombre as the 12,000 delegates said prayers and sang Psalm 46. God is our refuge and our strength, in straits a present aid. Therefore, although the earth remove, we will not be afraid. The convention hall was covered in many of the normal loyalist mottos and emblems. It also sported Éireann go Bragh, or Ireland Forever, a catch cry of the United Irishmen during the 1798 rebellion. But it was to an earlier revolution, the Protestant Revolution of King William, that the delegates looked to for their inspiration. It was this spirit that Liberal Unionist Thomas Sinclair caught in his speech.
We are children of the Revolution of 1688, and cost what it may, we will have nothing to do with the Dublin Parliament. If it be ever set up, we simply ignore its existence. Its acts will be but as waste paper. If Mr. Gladstone, in mad wantonness, can induce Parliament to pass it into law, Ulstermen will be idiots, and worse than idiots, if they do not utterly repudiate it.
No bill in the 19th century took up so much parliamentary time as Gladstone's second Home Rule Bill. There were 1,390 speeches, lasting in all 210 hours. The bill was passed in the House of Commons, but was then swiftly rejected in the Lords, the upper house. The members of the House of Lords weren't elected. They were rich and powerful men called aristocrats, who inherited their titles.
There should have been a crisis when these unelected lords rejected the wishes of a majority of MPs from the House of Commons. But the truth was that many Liberals were now tired of the Home Rule issue, and the Nationalists were still bitterly divided. In 1895, the Conservatives were back in power, and for the next 10 years pursued a policy that aimed to kill Home Rule with kindness. This policy involved an ambitious programme of public works designed to encourage social and economic development.
Roads were built as the Congested Districts Board gave special help to poor country areas along the impoverished Atlantic coastline. They promoted local crafts such as spinning and weaving and lacing, as shown in this class at Crawley. The board built harbours for fishermen, such as this one at Killybegs, Donegal. It was designed to encourage the fishing industry. The government proposed that landlords be bought out to make it possible for tenants to become owners of the farms they rented.
Many landlords were eager to sell, and those that weren't were soon forced to. The farmers themselves found that their repayments, known as annuities, were often lower than their previous rents. Now Ireland, north and south, was covered in family farms, where not long before there had only been vast estate resentment. In other European countries, such dramatic change only took place through violence and bloodshed. But while this quiet revolution had solved the Irish land question almost at a stroke, it didn't kill the deep-seated feelings of Irish nationalism.
In 1884, Michael Cusack formed the Gaelic Athletic Association, or GAA. The aim of the GAA was to revive and promote sports such as hurling and Gaelic football, which were regarded as being native to Ireland. Gaelic refers to the Gaels, the ancient Celtic people who settled in Ireland before the birth of Christ. They gave Ireland a rich and distinctive cultural tradition, as well as Gaelic, its native language. The GAA saw itself as part of a wider movement to create a sense of Irish national identity. Its members were forbidden to play foreign games such as rugby and cricket, which were regarded as being English in origin. The sportsmen of the GAA, like those working in other fields, were encouraging a move towards a degree of Irish independence. In the late 19th century, many Irish artists and illustrators started to work in a way that drew heavily on the style of ancient Celtic manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells. It shows how many Irish nationalists tended to look back to the Celtic past for their inspiration. Also, for many people, Gaelic culture was becoming associated exclusively with the Catholic community. Earlier in the 19th century, those who showed most interest in Ireland's ancient Gaelic culture had been Northern Protestants. Edward Bunting from Belfast spent most of his life travelling around Ireland collecting songs and airs, which he published in 1840 as the Ancient Music of Ireland. Samuel Ferguson was born in Belfast High Street, taught himself Irish and translated the epics of ancient Ireland into English. By the late 19th century, most Ulster Protestants thought of themselves as being British. Many now belonged to organisations such as the Orange Order, which had a religious and political identity very different from that of the rest of the Irish people. Few Unionists were interested in the activities of groups such as Conradh na Gaeilge, or the Gaelic League, which was set up in 1893. The object of the Gaelic League was to revive the Irish language, which had suffered a decline since the time of the famine. The Gaelic League was formed by three men. Douglas Hyde was the son of a Protestant clergyman in County Roscommon who spoke Irish as his first language. Owen MacNeill from Glenarm, County Antrim, was a professor of history in University College, Dublin. Father Growney was professor of Irish at Maynooth College. The Irish language had gone into dramatic decline in the second half of the 19th century, as many Irish speakers from the poor areas in the west of Ireland had died or emigrated during or just after the Great Famine. Irish wasn't taught in the national schools, and many tended to prefer to speak English, which was the language used to carry out business. Parents too felt that their children should speak English to get on in Ireland, or in England, or even America if they were forced to emigrate. So while associated in people's minds with backwardness and poverty, many resented this, and in consequence sought to assert their native language. In 1900, John Redmond took over the leadership of the Irish Parliamentary Party. While Redmond was dedicated to achieving home rule for Ireland, he also supported the British Empire. He believed that Ireland's cause should be pursued through peaceful means in the Westminster Parliament. Arthur Griffith was a member of the Gaelic League and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He founded a newspaper called the United Irishman, which promoted the nationalist cause. Sinn Féin was the name that he gave to the political party that he founded in 1905. Sinn Féin means ourselves alone in Irish. It was in Belfast, not in Dublin, that political battles were most intense. Here unionism was strongest, and here too were to be found the most dedicated nationalists. A group of men in Belfast belonged to the Irish Republican Brotherhood. These militant Northern Republicans included Dennis McCullough, a piano tuner from Belfast, and Bulmer Hobson, a Protestant journalist, formed the Dungannon Club in 1905. It was named in memory of the Dungannon Convention of 1782, when Protestant volunteers declared that England had no right to make laws for Ireland. Sean McDermott from County Leitrim was for a time a tram driver in Belfast. Thomas Clark, who was brought up in Dungannon, had served 15 years in prison for taking part in a bombing campaign in England in the 1880s. Patrick McCartan was a medical student from Carrickmore in County Tyrone. Sir Roger Casement was a Protestant from Ballycastle, County Antrim, and a retired British diplomat. These men of the Irish Republican Brotherhood believed passionately in their cause, but in the early years of the 20th century, out-and-out rebellion against the Crown must have seemed like an impossibility for the vast majority of Irish people. In 1906, the Liberals won the general election, but with such a vast majority, they didn't need the help of the Irish nationalists. And for a while, the public's interest turned to a growing conflict between working people and their employers. In the early years of the 20th century, food prices began to rise, and workers all over Europe found it more and more difficult to make ends meet. In 1905, there was an attempted revolution in Russia. There were strikes in France, Spain, and Italy. In Britain, industry was brought to a halt by disputes. Then in 1907, a great strike began in Belfast. The dispute was between the Belfast dockers belonging to the Dockers Union and their employers belonging to the Shipping Federation. Jim Larkin, the Liverpool Irish organiser of the Dockers Union, was the man who led the workers. Thomas Gallagher, who owned the world's largest tobacco factory, was the leader of the employers. The dockers under Jim Larkin had been campaigning for some time for better pay and conditions. When the employers asked the workers to leave their trade union,
or be dismissed from their job. Most workers refused. Then one morning in May 1907, as the dockers arrived for work as usual, they found the gates shut and locked against them. The employers had left instructions that the dockers were to be locked out and their jobs given to others, known as blacklegs. It was the beginning of a long and bitter strike.
Catholic dockers joined with Protestant dockers, and soon they were supported by carters, firemen, sailors, coal heavers and linen workers. Hard-pressed policemen had to escort loads to and from the docks. But by July, the police were exhausted, and they too went on strike. Troops were brought on the streets to prevent further disorder. There were confrontations and 2 people were killed, but by mid-September, the strike was over.
But the 1907 dockers' strike ended in an almost complete victory for the employers. Working men were quite simply not able to stay out of work month on end without any pay coming in to support their families. And the cooperation between Protestant and Catholic workers in Belfast didn't last long. It was to founder as the United Kingdom entered the most severe constitutional crisis of modern times. That crisis centred on the issue of Home Rule and the resistance of Ulster Protestants to the rule of a Dublin Parliament. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a complicated struggle for power here in Westminster between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, as to which group had the right to pass laws on behalf of the British people. This struggle was to have a profound effect on Irish affairs. Then, as now, all bills had to pass through both houses before becoming law. A bill passed in the Commons could be rejected in the Lords, and indeed this did happen with the defeat of the Second Home Rule Bill in 1893. The problem was that at the time there was always a majority of Conservative peers in the House of Lords, and this would often lead to conflict when the Liberal government was elected to power in the House of Commons. In 1910, the Liberal Prime Minister, Herbert Henry Asquith, put forward a Parliament bill which was designed to restrict the power of the House of Lords. Under the bill, the Lords had to accept any budget voted on and passed by the House of Commons. From this point on, no other bill could be rejected, but merely held up in the Lords for 3 sessions. That's about 2 years. The Lords rejected this Parliament bill, and the United Kingdom was soon facing the most severe constitutional crisis since the time of King William of Orange. The issue was about whether or not Ireland should have Home Rule. If the power of the Lords was restricted, then the last barrier to Home Rule would be removed. The Conservatives knew that if they resisted for much longer, they would face another humiliating defeat in a general election. So the Parliament bill was passed, and Asquith remained as Prime Minister with the support of Labour and Nationalist members of Parliament. In effect, John Redmond and his colleagues in the Irish Parliamentary Party held the balance of power. In the circumstances, it seemed inevitable that a bill granting limited home rule for Ireland would become law in a matter of a few short years. The Unionists in Ulster were only too aware that they could soon be ruled by a Dublin Parliament. They felt betrayed and unable to trust anyone but themselves. The Northern Loyalists were determined to resist Home Rule, and so were set firmly on a course that would lead them outside the laws of the land. In 1904, a body called the Ulster Unionist Council had been formed. It had representatives from all the 9 counties of the province of Ulster. Captain James Craig was the Ulster Unionist MP for East Down. Son of a rich whisky distiller,
He was a very skilled organiser and soon became the driving force behind Ulster Unionist resistance to Home Rule. In 1910, the Ulster Unionist Council formed a secret committee to buy weapons and equip an army of civilian volunteers who would be prepared to fight to resist Home Rule. Major Frederick Crawford was the most prominent figure of this committee. He had been an engineer on ships of the White Star Line and was a veteran of the war against the Boers in South Africa.
Crawford was a born conspirator. He adopted assumed names or aliases such as Hugh Matthews and John Ferguson, and proceeded to write to 5 European arms manufacturers, 2 of them the largest in Germany and Austria. He asked for a quotation for 20,000 rifles and 1 million rounds of ammunition, and he said they didn't have to be the latest model. In fact, he actually preferred second-hand ones in good order. After a long period of absence, the gun had returned to Irish politics.
The Ulster Unionists were arming themselves to resist Home Rule, and they now had a very capable leader in Edward Carson. Carson was a Dublin Protestant who had become one of the most successful lawyers of his day. He had been a member of previous Conservative governments, and he agreed to lead the Ulster Loyalists in the belief that if he could prevent Home Rule being applied in Ulster, then it could not be applied to the rest of Ireland. Carson made it clear that he would support the use of arms in order to stop Home Rule.
I know the responsibility you are putting on me today, and in your presence I cheerfully accept it, grave as it is. And I now enter into a compact with you and with every one of you, and with the help of God, you and I together will yet defeat the most nefarious conspiracy ever hatched upon a free people. We must be prepared, the morning Home Rule passes, ourselves to become responsible for the government of the Protestant province of Ulster.
Unionist leaders formed a provisional government ready to rule Ulster. Some thought that this was treason. Winston Churchill, the British Home Secretary, was the politician with the responsibility of putting forward the third Home Rule Bill in 1912 for the Liberal government. In Belfast, Churchill was given a hostile reception outside the Grand Central Hotel, which used to stand here on the site now occupied by Castle Court Shopping Centre.
Menacing crowds of demonstrators gathered in Royal Avenue outside the hotel and threatened to overturn his car, only to stop with cries of "Mind the woman" as they spotted Churchill's wife beside him. It was a bad beginning. Things got no better.
Belfast Corporation refused Churchill the use of the Ulster Hall, and so the Home Secretary had no choice but to speak to the supporters of Home Rule in a rain-sodden marquee tent in Celtic Park, in the Nationalist Falls Road area. Then, when the meeting was over, Churchill had to be escorted out of the city by a devious route, through nationalist areas where the inhabitants were sympathetic to the whole idea of Home Rule. People remembered the words of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, a quarter of a century earlier in 1886, and said that he left Belfast like a thief in the night. Bonner Law was leader of the Conservative Party. His father had been a Presbyterian minister in Coleraine, and he identified completely with Ulster Protestants. He ensured that the Conservatives gave their full support to the anti-Home Rule cause. On Easter Tuesday 1912, 70 special trains brought 100,000 loyalists to Belfast. After marching past the platforms, they listened to prayers and watched the largest Union flag ever woven unfurled from a 90-foot flagstaff. Edward Carson then introduced Bonner Law, who was the chief speaker of the day. He compared the position of the Northern Protestants to their ancestors, who just over 2 centuries before had defended the city of Londonderry during the famous siege of 1689.
Once again you hold the pass for the Empire. You are a besieged city. The timid have left you. Your Lundies have betrayed you, but you have shut your gates. The government have erected by their Parliament Act a boom against you to shut you off from the help of the British people. You will burst that boom. That help will come. And when the crisis is over, men will say, you saved yourselves by your exertions, and you will save the Empire by your example.
On Saturday the 29th of June, Protestant children on a Sunday school outing paraded through Castle Dawson, County Londonderry. They carried flags and banners with biblical texts and were accompanied by a band. There was no special political significance to the outing, but the children were attacked by members of the nationalist Ancient Order of Hibernians, who were also having a procession in the town. Several children were badly hurt, and some were found much later hiding in terror a mile away. By Monday, the story was in the Belfast newspapers, and Remember Castle Dawson soon became a loyalist watchword. On Tuesday, trouble broke out at the shipyards when Catholic workmen were surrounded by angry loyalists and ordered to leave the yards. Sectarian violence simmered throughout the summer, only to erupt in a serious incident on Saturday, the 14th of September.
The occasion was a football match at Celtic Park between the home team Belfast Celtic, supported mainly by Catholics, and Linfield with its fiercely loyalist following. Furious fighting broke out between the spectators, who used knives and even revolvers. 60 of the injured were treated at the nearby Royal Victoria Hospital. The danger of outright sectarian warfare loomed large, a prospect that alarmed the Unionist leaders, who knew that their cause would be damaged by violence and bloodshed.
On the morning of Saturday, the 28th of September 1912, Belfast city centre was packed with dense crowds of people. Like many thousand others in towns and villages throughout Ulster, they had come together in a common cause. The crowds of people had come to sign a solemn league and covenant in the newly built Belfast City Hall. The Ulster Covenant was a pledge to resist any moves towards granting home rule to Ireland. Men signed a covenant and women signed a declaration. In all, nearly 1 million people signed in towns and villages throughout Ulster. The Ulster Unionists were by now prepared to use the force of arms to prevent the rule of a Dublin Parliament being imposed on them.
The events of Ulster Day began here in the Ulster Hall, when James Craig took his place beside Sir Edward Carson. The hall was full, and those present were reminded that there should be no applause, as this was a religious service. The packed congregation sang, "O God, our help in ages past," and after prayers and lessons had been read, the Reverend Dr. William McKean, the former Presbyterian moderator, rose to deliver his sermon. It mixed politics with religion and quite clearly set out the viewpoint of the majority of Ulster Protestants. We are plain, blunt men who love peace and industry. The Irish question is at bottom a war against Protestantism. It is an attempt to establish a Roman Catholic ascendancy in Ireland, to begin the disintegration of the empire by securing a second parliament in Dublin.
When the religious service ended, the Unionist leaders walked the short distance to the City Hall. They were accompanied by an honour guard carrying a faded yellow silk banner, which it was claimed had been carried before King William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. Belfast City Hall was one of the most sumptuous public buildings in the United Kingdom and had only been opened 6 years earlier.
When Sir Edward Carson arrived at the City Hall, he advanced to here, where there was a circular table placed directly beneath the dome. The table was draped with the Union flag, and on it was placed a copy of the Covenant. Carson signed the Covenant with a silver pen. Then other leading Unionists, such as the Duke of Abercorn, Lord Londonderry, and Sir William Ewart, also signed.
Outside the City Hall, bowler-hatted stewards struggled to keep order as eager crowds of people came to sign the Covenant. It had been arranged that 550 men could sign at any one time. With the signing of the Covenant, the great mass of the Ulster Protestant population demonstrated that if need be, they were willing to fight to defend the interests of their community. In January 1913, the Ulster Unionist Council decided that up to 100,000 men should be recruited into a volunteer army to be called the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF. At first, dummy rifles made of pine were used to train the men who flocked to join the UVF, but soon many had real rifles in what had become a well-organised and disciplined force. The UVF contained a whole series of specialist units, which included cavalry, signallers, dispatch riders, doctors and nurses. The UVF saw great potential in motor transport and organised a motor car corps. In the event of an emergency, the corps was to be used to carry volunteers to the scene of the fighting and refugees away from it. By drawing up these plans, the UVF was well ahead of its time, because the regular army had yet to use motor transport in this way.
The third Home Rule Bill was passed in the House of Commons, then rejected in the House of Lords. Even so, it now seemed only a matter of time before it became law. And with loyalists organising resistance,
it appeared that some form of armed conflict was now inevitable. At first, the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, could see no way out of the crisis.
In 1913, the government started to seriously consider the division or partition of Ireland into two parts. Under this plan, the areas in northeast Ulster that had a Protestant majority would be split off from the rest of Ireland. John Redmond knew that his nationalist supporters would not let him accept anything but an undivided Ireland ruled from Dublin. He said that Irish nationalists can never be assenting parties to the mutilation of the Irish nation. The two-nation theory is to us an abomination and a blasphemy. However, while the Ulster Unionists appeared united and strong, the Irish nationalists were weak and divided. In August 1913, a great strike began here at the showgrounds of the Royal Dublin Society in Ballsbridge. The tram drivers stopped their vehicles and simply walked away. Soon the entire Dublin working class had stopped work, locked out by their own employers. The strikers were led by Jim Larkin, the leader of the 1907 dockers' strike in Belfast. Martin Murphy, owner of the Irish Independent newspaper, led the employers who had decided to destroy the power of the union workers. There were violent confrontations between the strikers and police on the streets of Dublin. Many were injured, and Jim Larkin was arrested in one such incident. The strikers had to face real hardship as the dispute dragged on for months. Food ships from Liverpool arrived here at Dublin's North Wall Quay every week, and soup kitchens were set up to feed the starving strikers and their families. Eventually, however, the strikers drifted back to work, driven by poverty and hunger. The Great Lockout was over, but both employers and workers were supporters of the Home Rule cause. The whole affair had created a disastrous split in the ranks of Irish nationalists. On November 25th, 1913, 3,000 men enlisted in a new body called the Irish Volunteers. The Irish Volunteers were Irish nationalists who were pledged to support the authority of a Home Rule Parliament in Dublin. Professor Owen MacNeill from the Glens of Antrim was the president of the Irish Volunteers. Within 6 months, the Irish Volunteers had grown into a force of at least 100,000 men who had started to march and drill throughout Ireland. James Connolly was born in Scotland of Irish parents and was determined to fight for an Irish Socialist Republic. Connolly formed another group called the Irish Citizen Army. By the beginning of 1914, it appeared that events in Ulster were moving out of the control of the government. Herbert Asquith decided that decisive action had to be taken to prevent the Ulster Unionist Council from forming their own provisional government with the support of the UVF. A naval squadron, including 7 battleships, was sent to patrol the waters around Ulster, and preparations were made to send in troops to guard arms dumps and keep the peace. But all these plans came to a halt with an incident that came to be known as the Curragh Mutiny. At the Curragh military camp in County Kildare, 80 cavalry officers announced that they would prefer to be dismissed rather than lead their men against the Ulster Loyalists. Their refusal did much to undermine the authority of the government in the eyes of the people of Ireland. At the time, the UVF was armed, but with a mixed collection of rifles that used different sorts of ammunition. In 1913, plans were made to smuggle a huge consignment of modern arms into Ulster from Germany by ship. Larne was chosen as the port where the main consignment was to be landed. Only 12 men knew the exact details of the secret plan, but on Saturday the 25th of April 1914, they mobilized the entire UVF in a highly effective military operation. A decoy ship, the SS Balmerino, was sent into Belfast Harbour to divert the authorities, while the SS Clyde Valley steamed into Larne Harbour under cover of darkness. In all, 25,000 German and Italian rifles and 5 million rounds of ammunition were landed here at Larne and at Bangor and Donaghadee. The guns were then distributed throughout the province by convoys of motor cars, then placed in hiding. It had been the first time that the motor car had been used in a large-scale military-type operation anywhere in the world. The UVF was now fully armed and ready to fight for God and Ulster. As the danger of civil war in Ireland loomed ever larger, people wondered how the Irish nationalists would respond to the arming of the UVF. On the 26th of July, a yacht called the Asgard sailed into Howth Harbour near Dublin. It was owned by Erskine Childers, an Englishman who supported the Home Rule cause. The Asgard was carrying a consignment of rifles that had been bought in Germany. They were unloaded by units of the Irish Volunteers. Many were taken into Dublin city centre.
Troops were called out, but as they tried to confiscate the rifles, they were met by jeering, stone-throwing crowds. Some soldiers opened fire along the Liffey Quays, killing 3 people and wounding 38 others. Nationalists were incensed, knowing that the UVF had been allowed to bring in their guns without interference. Ireland was on the brink of a civil war.
At the end of July 1914, Ireland seemed to be on the brink of civil war, but that was prevented by the outbreak of a terrible European conflict, the First World War.
The outbreak of the First World War was to have a dramatic effect on events in Ireland. On Friday the 7th of August 1914, the citizens of Omagh, County Tyrone, witnessed a scene considered impossible just a week earlier. At 9:30 p.m, the Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers left the St. Lucia barracks in the town to join with the British Expeditionary Force in France. What was remarkable about this was that they were seen off by contingents of the Irish Volunteers and the UVF, who paraded the town together. There was a similar event the next day in Strabane, when Captain Roderick Gallagher of the Irish Volunteers called for 3 cheers for the Ulster Volunteers, a call responded to in a most spirited manner by Captain William Smith and his men. So, men who just a short time before had been intent on fighting each other, either for or against Home Rule, were now at peace, while the rest of the world was very definitely at war.
On the 18th of September 1914, the third Home Rule Bill became law. Ireland was to get a separate parliament in Dublin, but not until the war was over. Also, Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister, announced that special provision would be made for Ulster. What exactly this special provision would be wasn't made clear, but it seemed to suggest that when the war was over, Ireland would be divided.
I'm a recruiting sergeant for the Royal Irish Rifles, and I'm looking for lads like you. And a fine-looking bunch of lads you are, too.
All over the United Kingdom, a great drive was started to recruit men to fight for king and country.
You all know what's going on in Belgium. There are them Huns. They're burning and raping and looting. You wouldn't allow that sort of thing to go on in Armagh or down Patrick or Lurgan.
It was the job of the recruiting sergeant to encourage fit young men to join the army to fight against the Germans.
You had to be at least 17 before you could join the army, but many lied about their age. Indeed, many of the recruits were 16 and some were as young as 13 or 14. When the eager young men arrived at a recruiting office, they were given a medical examination and a shilling, about 5 pence in today's money. The King's shilling was 1 day's army pay.
You'll get a good uniform, and sure, don't take girls like that. Your friends are all going, why would you want to stay behind and hang around street corners, working on them out in mills day and daily? The army will make a man of you.
Many thought they would only have to spend a short time in the army, as it was a widely held belief that the war would be over by Christmas. In all, it's estimated that over 150,000 Irishmen joined up to fight in the various regiments of the British Army. They came from all over Ireland, both Catholic and Protestant. Sir Edward Carson and John Redmond encouraged their followers to join up.
People's hopes for an early end to war weren't realized. The Germans were halted north of Paris and the rapid movement of armies came to an end. Both sides dug themselves into lines of trenches on 2 enormous war fronts. One front ran from Switzerland in the east to the North Sea coast in the west. The other front ran all the way from the Black Sea to the Baltic. Many of those who joined up wanted to stay together in groups that displayed particular loyalties, but most of the Irish volunteers were dispersed into different regiments throughout the army. This caused a certain amount of resentment among nationalists. who saw that this wasn't happening with the men of the Ulster Volunteer Force. The UVF men were kept together in one group, which was called the 36th Ulster Division.
By the front! Quick! March! Left, right, left, right, left, right.
They were sent to training camps at Finner, County Donegal, Clandyboy near Bangor, and Ballykinler, County Down. Soon they were a disciplined fighting force and ready to go to war. On the 8th of May 1915, the centre of Belfast was once again packed with dense crowds who had come to see the men of the 36th Ulster Division parade through the city for the last time. They marched away, followed by motor ambulances, each marked by the name of the town which had donated it.
War in trenches like these was deadly. The trenches soon became waterlogged, and the men would have to huddle beneath the parapets in deep mud. There they survived as best they could, plagued by rats, lice, bursting artillery shells. Then again and again the order would be given. The men would leap over the top, bayonets fixed to their rifles, and charge blindly across the barbed wire entanglements of no man's land towards the enemy.
Back home in Ireland, however, people had never been so well off as they strove to meet the demands of the Allies for food and war materials. Farmers were growing more and more flax to supply the linen trade, which normally got its supplies from Belgium, which was now occupied by the Germans. Mills and weaving factories all over Ulster made the fighting fibre up into all sorts of things needed for the war effort. Linen was used to make surgical bandages, kit bags, tarpaulins, water bags and uniforms. It was even used to cover the frames of the flimsy aircraft that were used in the First World War. The shipyards too were working around the clock, making standard ships, which were simplified cargo vessels, needed to replace those sunk by mines and submarines.
Ireland was prospering, but as the war dragged on into its second year, home rule seemed as far away as ever, and some Irish nationalists were growing impatient. The Irish volunteers had split. Most supported the British war effort, but others refused to support the British Army in a fight that they didn't think was theirs. Among them were members of a secret revolutionary organisation known as the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB.
The IRB believed that England's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity, meaning that when England was preoccupied with war, the British were vulnerable to attack on Ireland. The IRB hoped to enlist German support in planning a rebellion against the British, which was to start on Easter Sunday, 1916. The aim of this rebellion was to establish an Irish Republic, an independent country without a king or queen at its head. Patrick Pearse helped to plan this rebellion. He was a poet, teacher and writer who declared himself head of the provisional government. It was planned that units of the Irish Volunteers would fight in this rebellion. James Connolly wasn't a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but he led units of the Irish Citizens' Army into this uprising. Sir Roger Casement was an IRB member. He went to Germany and arranged for a German ship to bring 20,000 rifles and 5 million rounds of ammunition to County Kerry at Easter 1916. The vessel, the Odd, was disguised as a Norwegian trawler, and had managed to dodge the Royal Naval blockade and arrived in Tralee Bay on the afternoon of Thursday the 19th of April 1916.
Unfortunately, there was no one there to meet it. The Irish Republicans had sent a message to Germany, but the Odd had no radio on board to receive it. So after waiting for 24 hours, the captain steamed out to sea only to be captured by the Royal Navy. Escorted to Cork Harbour, he ordered that his ship should be scuttled and sunk, and the IRB rifles ended up on the seabed.
While the Odd was lying off Tralee, a German submarine carrying Roger Casement was also there, but the two vessels failed to make contact. Then in the early hours of Good Friday 1916, Casement and two companions were put ashore in a collapsible boat.
On their way ashore, the boat overturned, and Casement almost drowned. Too weak to go on into Tralee with his companions and meet local Republicans, Casement hid in a prehistoric castle known locally as McKenna's Fort. Around lunchtime on Good Friday, two local policemen arrested Casement, and once his identity had been established, took him to Dublin and from there to the Tower of London. The first act of the Easter Rebellion had ended in utter chaos.
Owen McNeill was the president of the Irish Volunteers, but he was only told on Saturday about the rebellion that was planned for the following day. He came here to St Enda's School, Rathfarnham, near Dublin, where Patrick Pearse was the principal. He tried to persuade Pearse to stop the rebellion, but was told that our plans are all made and will be carried out. McNeill had no intentions of betraying the conspirators to the British, so instead he placed an advertisement in the Sunday newspapers, cancelling all orders for the Irish volunteers. Faced with this, Pearse and Connolly decided to postpone the rising, but only until Easter Monday. With the appearance of this newspaper advertisement and the capture of Sir Roger Casement, the British authorities thought that the threat of rebellion had been averted. So Dublin was peaceful and quiet on Easter Monday 1916. Indeed, most of the British garrison had left the city to spend the day at the Ferry House races. The Irish Republican forces were to be virtually unopposed as they marched out to stage a rebellion that few thought had any real chance of military success. At noon, men of the Irish Citizen Army and the Irish Volunteers charged across Sackville Street and entered the General Post Office. The rebels ran up 2 flags on the top of the building that was now their headquarters. One was a green, white and orange tricolour that signified peace between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. The second was a green flag with the words Irish Republic written on it. After a few minutes, Patrick Pearse stepped out here in front of the GPO and read the proclamation of the Irish Republic to a small crowd of sceptical onlookers.
Poblacht Nairn, Irishmen and Irishwomen, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom.
The Republican plan was to seize a number of large buildings in the centre of Dublin. These strong points were, however, surrounded by a ring of British Army barracks. At the beginning of the rebellion, the British only had about 2,500 soldiers in the Dublin area. Kingstown Harbour, now known as Dunleary, was used to bring in reinforcements from England. Unfamiliar with the area, they advanced north through the Dublin suburbs until they came to a complete halt on the bridge that crosses the Grand Canal at Mount Street. They were pinned down by a few volunteers firing from nearby houses and lost over 200 men killed or wounded, half the entire British Army casualties in the rebellion. Despite this setback, the British forces started to close in on the Republican positions in the city centre. The British started to shell rebel positions with artillery, and soon much of the city centre was in flames. James Connolly was wounded, and many others were killed as the battle raged around the GPO. Then on the afternoon of Saturday the 29th of April, Patrick Pearse surrendered on the steps of the post office. The rebellion was over, but at a cost of many lives and many more wounded. At first, nationalist opinion condemned the rebellion. Members of the general public spat and jeered at Republican prisoners as they were led away into military custody. People blamed the rebels for the ruin of their city, and many thought that they had betrayed thousands of Irish troops who were overseas fighting in the war. Many of the most prominent prisoners were taken to Kilmainham jail, where they were tried by military courts. In all, 90 were condemned to death. "14 of those condemned to die were brought here, within the walls of an old stonebreaker's yard in Kilmainham jail, and executed by firing squad. Those rebel leaders who signed the proclamation of the Irish Republic expected to die, but there were others who were shot who were just ordinary volunteers. The execution stretched out over 9 days, between the 3rd and 12th of May, and created a wave of sympathy among many nationalists. Had all the executions been carried out on the one day, the effect on nationalist Ireland might not have been so great. Over 3,000 people were arrested. Some of them, including Arthur Griffith, had taken no part in the rebellion. The executions and arrests marked the start of a long-term shift in nationalist public opinion, as many turned against the British. Many Republican prisoners seized the opportunity to reorganize to resist British rule. The Irish Republicans had made a sacrifice in blood for their country, Ireland, and they sensed that with more and more public support, victory was within their grasp. But in the meantime, It was the turn of the Ulster Unionists to make their own blood sacrifice for the British cause. At the end of June 1916, artillery started to bombard German positions on the Western Front. The massive bombardment was designed to destroy German trenches. It was a prelude to the Battle of the Somme.
At 7:10 on the morning of the 1st of July, 1916, men of the Ulster Division climbed out of their trenches and formed up in no man's land, where they were concealed by mist and smoke. It was the anniversary of the original date of the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. Some men wore orange lilies, and at least one sergeant draped an orange sash over his uniform. At 7:30 exactly, the heavy artillery stopped firing, and the Ulstermen advanced at a steady marching pace towards the German lines.
The artillery barrage hadn't succeeded in destroying the German fortifications, and the Ulstermen met stiff opposition. But they advanced as far as the German fourth line of defence, where the fighting was like a Belfast riot on top of Mount Vesuvius. Exposed to relentless fire, whole companies were wiped out, and by nightfall, all gains had been lost. In just the first 2 days of the Battle of the Somme, 5,500 men of the Ulster Division had been killed or wounded. 17-year-old Private Herbert Beattie wrote home to Belfast with news of the carnage.
Dear Mother, tell them that there is not another Grosvenor Road fellow left but myself. Mother, we were tramping over the dead. Think there is only about 400 left out of about 1,300. Mother, if God spares me to get home safe, I will have something awful to tell you. If hell is any worse, I would not like to go to it.
In December 1916, Lloyd George became Prime Minister and started to release Republican prisoners. They returned home to a welcome that wouldn't have seemed possible just a year previously, and they immediately started to organise.
In April 1917, a group of Irish Republicans met here at the Mansion House in Dublin to launch a new political party dedicated to winning complete independence for Ireland. The party was to be called Sinn Féin, or Ourselves Alone, using the name of the unsuccessful party formed by Arthur Griffith in 1905. The new Sinn Féin wanted to achieve a fully independent Irish Republic.
Eamon de Valera was the leader of Sinn Féin. He had commanded Republican forces during the Easter Rebellion. Michael Collins also fought during Easter 1916 and helped to reorganise the volunteers while in prison. In 1917, de Valera won East Clare for Sinn Féin in a by-election. Sinn Féin was becoming the most important nationalist party.
Despite their success, Sinn Féin refused to attend the Irish Convention, a conference organised by Lloyd George to discuss Ireland's future. The convention was held here in Trinity College, Dublin in 1917 and 1918. 20 Ulster Unionists did attend, but they had already decided they wanted Ireland divided, so that the 6 northeastern counties would remain part of the United Kingdom. So with Irish people more bitterly divided than ever, the convention was bound to fail.
Early in 1918, John Dillon succeeded Redmond as leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party and faced the challenge of Sinn Féin. Germany was threatening to win the war, and Britain desperately needed more men to fight in France. So the government imposed conscription on Ireland, meaning that men could be called up to serve in the armed forces whether they wanted to or not. All of nationalist Ireland united to oppose conscription.
John Dillon led his nationalist MPs out of Westminster, and the British government had to back down because they couldn't forcibly introduce conscription. But it was Sinn Féin with its more extreme view that would eventually benefit from the whole affair. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, fighting stopped in Europe. Germany was defeated, and soon afterwards Lloyd George announced a general election. After this election, Ireland would never be the same again.
There are two. November the 8th, 1918, military leaders from Germany met with the Allies to discuss peace terms. Then on the 11th, the guns fell silent all over Europe. After 4 long years of fighting, 4 empires had collapsed and tens of millions had been killed or wounded. The First World War was finally over. The leaders of the Allies who had won the war were about to begin the task of redrawing the map of Europe. New nation states like Poland and Czechoslovakia would soon emerge from the ruins.
Irish soldiers on the Western Front were now looking forward to going home to what they hoped was peace. But these soldiers, both Catholic and Protestant, knew they were going back to face problems left unresolved from before the war. Many nationalists now felt they had a real chance of securing Ireland's independence from Britain. Unionists felt threatened by this and were equally determined to resist any move that placed them under Dublin Parliament. Whatever their views, the future was still uncertain.
Lloyd George called an immediate general election just before Christmas 1918, and when it was over, he was still Prime Minister. In Ireland, nationalists voted for Sinn Féin candidates rather than those of the Irish Parliamentary Party. But the new Sinn Féin MPs refused to take their seats at Westminster and instead decided to set up their own parliament in Dublin. It met for the first time in the Mansion House in Dublin on the 21st of January 1919. The new parliament was called Dáil Éireann, meaning the Assembly of Ireland. All of those who were elected to Irish seats in the Westminster Parliament were invited by Sinn Féin to attend the first session of Dáil Éireann here in Dublin. This included the Ulster Unionists, who of course declined, as Sinn Féin wanted to break the link with Britain. Only 27 Sinn Féin MPs attended to debate Ireland's future. Nearly all the rest, 34 of them, were in prison. Sinn Féin members called themselves deputies rather than members of Parliament and accepted a short written constitution for Ireland. They then made a declaration of Irish independence, stating that the Irish Republic began in Dublin on Easter Monday 1916 when Patrick Pearse read the proclamation from the steps of the General Post Office. Sean T. O'Kelly went to Paris for Dáil Éireann to make a case for an Irish Republic at the post-war peace conference, but he failed in his mission because Woodrow Wilson, the American president, wanted to stick by his ally, Britain. Michael Collins, who had fought in the Easter Rising, was the finance minister of Dáil Éireann. He managed to raise money to help set up alternative systems of government. With the money raised, Sinn Féin was able to set up its own town and county councils and had its own courts and Republican police force. As a result of this, in some parts of Ireland, British rule was partly paralysed. In 1919, Eamon de Valera went to the United States to raise money from Irish Americans sympathetic to the Republican cause. In all, he raised about $5 million to buy weapons, to be used in a military campaign against British rule in Ireland. The violence had already begun in County Tipperary on the 21st of January 1919, the very day the Dáil first met. 2 policemen escorting explosives to Solohead Beg Quarry were shot dead by masked men who then stole their rifles and the explosives. It was the start of a guerrilla war that was to spread throughout Ireland. Michael Collins was the man who organised this war against British rule. Police were attacked and the army had to assist them as they went on patrol. It was difficult to identify their attackers because they wore no uniforms. The volunteers were soon known as the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, and they had the official approval of Dáil Éireann.
The IRA conducted a campaign of terror which was much more vicious and widespread than anything ever experienced in Ireland before. Magistrates and other government officials were killed. Bodies with labels that read "Spy, killed by the IRA" were left at the roadside. People, mainly Catholics, were mutilated and killed because they cooperated with the government or had friends in the police or military. The purpose of it all was to make it impossible for the British authorities to exercise the normal rule of law.
The men of the Royal Irish Constabulary bore the brunt of IRA attacks, and soon military rule had to be imposed over large areas of the country. District Inspector James Hamilton Duggan served in Birr, Kings County, now called County Offaly, from 1920 to 1922. The men under his command had to deal with many violent incidents during this period of great unrest. His journal records the details. Sunday, 17th of April. Attended divine service. Visited patrol, 9:30 to 10 p.m. Monday, 18th April. To scene of outrage via Frankfurt. Malicious burning, Lee Beg. Tuesday, 19th of April. inspected Shinroon Station 3 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. To Kaniti, re-outrage of shooting of police. Constable Dunn dead, 3 wounded, 6:15 to 10:30 p.m. To military barracks with wounded, 11:15 p.m. Constables Doran, Fitzgerald and Connor were wounded. Wednesday, 20th of April, to Kaniti, 10 a.m. Search for suspects. Richard Conway and William Cordial arrested. Drove Knockbarron Hill, visited and searched houses in Kaniti vicinity. Returned 6 p.m. To military barracks with specialist, re-operation on Constable Doran. 8:45 to 12 o'clock, arranged with military for Constable Dunn's funeral. Constable Doran died, 1:20 a.m. Men were leaving the Irish police in droves because of the very real threat to their lives. The rule of law was beginning to be replaced by the rule of the gun. In 1920, Lloyd George decided to reinforce the police with temporary recruits from Britain. Many were war veterans, and because of a shortage of equipment, they wore uniforms that mixed the black-green berets and belts of the police with army khaki. Because of this, they became quickly known as the Black and Tans. They were tough men, and their often brutal methods soon antagonized the bulk of the nationalist population. Gradually, the war spread throughout the country, but in the north, it took on a particularly sectarian tinge. In Ulster, the Protestant community identified strongly with Britain and was prepared to resist any nationalist moves to create an independent Ireland. In early 1920, the Unionists lost control of Londonderry Corporation to the Nationalists and Sinn Féin. Derry had been a symbol of Protestant defiance in the face of Catholic Ireland for over 200 years, ever since the time of the Great Siege of 1688-89, when Protestant forces held the city against the Catholic armies of King James. Unionists were fearful for the future when they heard a speech aimed directly at them, made by Alderman Hugh O'Doherty, the city's first Catholic mayor.
Rest assured, mighty changes are coming in Ireland. Do you Protestants wish to play a part in them? The Unionist position is no longer tenable. Your leaders are abandoning it. Do you not see that Englishmen are prepared to sacrifice you if they can secure the goodwill of the rest of Ireland? Ireland's right to determine her own destiny will come about whether the Protestants of Ulster like it or not.
Trouble began in the streets of Derry in April 1920, when some Republican prisoners were brought to Bishop Street Jail, near where the Catholic Bogside and the Protestant Fountain districts meet. The UVF began firing down into the Bogside from the city walls. Then the IRA managed to dislodge the UVF from St Columb's College on Windmill Hill, the site of a Protestant victory during the siege of 1689. The British Army arrived on the 23rd of June in an attempt to restore order. Despite the presence of the troops, the killing continued, and the death toll for the city was eventually 40. Sinn Féin still posed a threat to Ulster's position within the United Kingdom. So, Sir Edward Carson warned the government that we in Ulster will tolerate no Sinn Féin. We tell you that we will take the matter into our own hands. We will reorganise.
In the volatile atmosphere of Belfast, some loyalists took Carson's call to take the matter into our own hands quite literally. The 21st of July was the first full day back at work after the 12 holidays. It was also the day of the funeral of Colonel G.F. Smith, a Banbridge Protestant and Divisional Commissioner of the RIC, who had been shot dead in Cork 4 days previously. On this day, Protestant workers in the Belfast shipyards met at their dinner hour and decided to drive disloyal, that is, Catholic workers, out of the yard, on suspicion that they supported the IRA's campaign. Loyalists saw this as an opportunity to vent their frustrations on Catholics in an outburst of sectarian hatred. The gates were smashed down with sledges. The vests and shirts were torn open to see if men were wearing Catholic emblems, and woe betide the man who was. One man was set upon and thrown into the dock. He had to swim the Musgrave Channel, and having been pelted with rivets, had to swim for 2 or 3 miles to emerge in streams of blood and rush to the nearest police office in a nude state.
Sectarian rioting continued throughout the summer, with some of the worst fighting occurring in the lower Newtonards Road area of Belfast, where a large Protestant district borders on the much smaller Catholic Short Strand. The intimidation of Catholics was widespread throughout Ulster. Many were expelled from their jobs and driven from their homes. In the south of Ireland, there wasn't the same sectarian rioting, but the IRA's campaign against the police was to leave over 100 dead by the end of September 1920. It was to create a vicious cycle of killing and reprisal.
On the evening of September 20th, 1920, Head Constable Burke and some friends were having a drink in this bar in Balbriggan, County Dublin, when IRA volunteers entered the bar and opened fire, leaving Burke dead and one other seriously wounded. When news of this murder reached the Black and Tans at their depot in Gormanstown, 3 miles away, they immediately piled into their motor tenders and headed for Balbriggan.
The Black and Tans drew up at the first public house, smashed in the door, seized bottles of whiskey, and then set fire to the place. They then rampaged through the town, burning 3 more pubs and a stocking factory owned by an English firm. In all, they destroyed 30 homes and damaged a further 30. The temporary policemen killed 2 civilians, shooting and bayoneting them in their nightshirts. Local people were forced out of their homes to become temporary refugees.
Nationalists were often appalled by the cold-blooded murders carried out in their name by the IRA. But at the same time, they were infuriated by the casual brutality of the reprisals by the Black and Tans, which the government made no attempt to stop. All most people could do was to continue with their lives in the midst of this murder and mayhem.
The situation created a widespread atmosphere of fear and suspicion, which could only widen the gulf between the British and the nationalist population. Gun battles erupted in crowded streets, and no one could be sure what would happen next. In some areas, the IRA was organised into larger units, known as flying columns. These flying columns could move about without fear that they would be reported to the police or military. In the spring of 1920, Thomas McCurtain, the Lord Mayor of Cork, was murdered in his home by out-of-uniform members of the security forces. Terence McSweeney replaced him as Lord Mayor, but was arrested in August while attending an IRA conference in Cork Town Hall. Like many other IRA prisoners, McSweeney refused food and died after 74 days on hunger strike. His funeral in Cork was attended by vast numbers of mourners and generated a great wave of nationalist sympathy for the IRA. The IRA was making plans to kill British intelligence agents living in the Dublin area, and these plans were put into operation on Sunday the 21st of November 1920, a day that was soon to be known as Bloody Sunday. 14 people were killed in the course of the morning, and the killings were followed by immediate reprisals that sent shockwaves through the country. That afternoon, Dublin was playing against Tipperary in a Gaelic football match at Croke Park on the other side of Dublin. During the course of the match, police and auxiliaries opened fire, killing 13 civilians and 1 member of the Tipperary team. That night, 3 Republican prisoners were killed in the guardroom of Dublin Castle. In 1920, Lloyd George at last completed his political plan for Ireland, which was known as the Better Government of Ireland Act. His solution was to divide or partition the island into 2 parts. Southern Ireland would have 26 counties and Northern Ireland the 6 northeastern counties. Each part was to continue to send some members to Westminster, but each was to have its own Home Rule Parliament, one in Belfast and the other in Dublin. King George V came to Belfast on the 22nd of June 1921 to open the new Northern Parliament, which met in the City Hall. The King made a speech appealing for an end to the fighting.
This is a great and critical occasion in the history of the 6 counties, but not for the 6 counties alone, for everything which interests them touches Ireland. I speak from a full heart when I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards ending the strife amongst her people, whatever their race or creed. In that hope, I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and forget, and to join in making for the land which they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill.
King George V was addressing only Unionists when he spoke here in the Council Chamber of Belfast City Hall. Nationalist and Sinn Féin members refused to accept the Parliament to which they had been elected, so they didn't attend. Nevertheless, the King's words were clearly intended to reach far beyond the walls of this chamber. He hoped they would influence the future actions of all of the Irish people, nationalist and unionist alike. The fighting between the British and the IRA wasn't to end until July 1921, when a truce was agreed and discussions began about what form Home Rule was going to take for the rest of Ireland. Eamon de Valera was the leader of the Irish Republicans, but he didn't go to London for the final talks. Arthur Griffith, the original leader of Sinn Féin, led the Irish delegation during the negotiations. These negotiations lasted throughout the autumn of 1921 and attracted great interest among Irish sympathisers in London. In the end, it was agreed that the 26 counties would become a self-governing dominion of the British Empire, like Canada. It was to be called Saoirstead Éireann, the Irish Free State. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed at 2 o'clock in the morning, the 6th of December 1922, here at 10 Downing Street in London. But the treaty was a compromise, unlikely to satisfy everyone. The delegates all knew that the more extreme elements of the IRA were unlikely to accept all the terms of the treaty. Indeed, during the journey home to Ireland, Michael Collins was to write that by putting his name to the treaty, he was, in effect, signing his own death warrant. His instincts were correct, for in less than a year's time, Collins would be killed by his former IRA comrades. The debates in Dáil Éireann about the treaty created bitter divisions among Republicans. De Valera and others could not accept that Irishmen and Irish women would still be required to declare their loyalty to the British Crown. The Republican movement split, and by the end of June 1922, civil war had broken out in the Irish Free State. This civil war was to last for nearly a year and cost the lives of as many as 4,000 people. And sectarian battles in the newly formed Northern Ireland were to claim another 552 lives. Peace was to return to Ireland by the summer of 1923. Now there were 2 Home Rule parliaments on the island instead of 1. The majority of